Good afternoon, everyone. Our reading today in the second part of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 from verse 11 to 21, a closer walk with God. In fact, that is what Paul was appealing to the Corinthians. Even we continue to read from today until tomorrow. That is his ultimate plea. And it is also very much applicable to us when we are still on this world, a closer walk with God every day. Today, touching on the second part of chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, I titled my sharing today, Towards Obedience. Towards Obedience. So from yesterday's reading, the first part of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1 to 10, we've read about Paul, okay? He had all the reason to boast of himself, and yet he chose not to boast on his worldly success. Okay, we know about his credential, but he boasts on his weakness. And we know the reason is if he has done so, he will be following the footsteps of the so-called super apostles, as mentioned in today's reading. Who are the super apostles? Okay, the Judaizers. Or even today, we are able to find many super apostles among churches around the world. Now, by boasting that it's in his weakness that he can boast. It is the same for us. When we boast in our weakness, the power of Christ can work through us. Okay, when we boast in our weakness, that's what Paul did, the power of Christ can work through us. And that will give us courage and hope, because we now then recognize our own limitations, and thus we depend more on God every day. By affirming God's strength and involvement in Paul's life, indirectly in our life, especially when we are weak, especially in this season of time, it helps in developing our Christian character and deepening our love for God. That's why God spoke to Paul and said, "My grace is sufficient for you." Or in the NLT version, "My grace is all you need." 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. God is sufficient, and he takes care of our spiritual, our material, our physical needs. And it is sufficient to save us while we are suffering. And what Paul has said, in the mix of his spiritual, material, and physical suffering, yet God's grace is sufficient for him and for us. So that in the mix of such boasting, quote unquote boasting, Paul continued in today's reading to reprimand the Corinthians, to make him like a fool, to boast in order to prove his apostleship. Okay, verse 11, the first verse that we read today. He has to make himself a fool to boast, just to prove his apostleship. So in reverse psychology, he's saying that though he considered himself nothing or at the lowest in whatever hierarchy, yet he is more genuine than the super apostles. He's using the reverse psychology here. So this part of the letter demonstrated Paul's love for the Corinthians, and he made his last appeal to them before he met them again during his coming mission trip, which is his third mission trip, okay, around Asia Minor. So instead of a potential or a very painful or hostile encounter, Paul here attempted to encourage them, to motivate them towards obedience, towards submission to God, and submission and obedience to the word of God. So let us read now Paul's message in motivating the Corinthians and how it can be applicable to us today.
11. I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, but I'm not in the least inferior, for I'm not in the least inferior to the super apostle, even though I'm nothing. I persevere in demonstrating among you the mark of the true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. How were you inferior to other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. Now I am ready to visit you for a third time, and I will not be a burden to you, because what I want is not your possession, but you. After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. So I will very gladly spend for you everything I have and expend myself as well. For I love you more, will you love me less? Be that as it may, I have not been a burden to you. Yet, crafty fellow that I am, I caught you by trickery. Did I exploit you through any of the men I sent to you? I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not walk in the same footsteps by the same Spirit? Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? We have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ. And everything we do, dear friends, is for your strengthening. Verse 20. For I am afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. I fear that there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. For I'm afraid that when I come again, my God will humble me before you, and I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of their impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged.
So in a nutshell, from verse 11 to 21, Paul, in a sense, he was giving early warning to the Corinthians, say, I know what you are doing. I know what you are going after. Smooth talkers, things that, have taken them away from the true path of the gospel. I know all the sinful activities that is still happening in your church, and I am coming soon. And I'm coming as your spiritual father. So you better back up, because by then it will be, in today's word, we call a very ugly sin when we met. In a nutshell, this is what this 11 verses is trying to tell us. But what I want to share today is what are the reflections, what are the points that we can draw, from this just 11 verses. The first point, it is lack of appreciations from verse 11 to verse 13. Here, Paul, indirectly, he was telling the Corinthians that they should stay true to the gospel instead of being influenced or swayed away by the Judaism. He used the word super apostles. He was saddened and he was hurt that the church he literally planted and built up, they cast doubt on Paul about his apostleship. They were attracted to smooth talk, or what we call today easy believism. Okay, a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel, which he mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4. They have now believed in a different Jesus, a different spirit, and a different gospel. So when was Paul being a show off when he say how much better he is compared to those smooth talkers? Was it a show off when he said that I did all the signs and miracles in verse 12? Not at all. He is defending himself for the cause of the gospel. It must have pained Paul so much that he has to boast in such a way. But yet we can see throughout his writing, he maintained Christ-like humility, not for his own ego, but for the sake of the Corinthian to follow the true gospel. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. I fear that somehow your pure and undivided devotion to Christ will be corrupted. And this is Paul's intentions. The reflection point, as I said earlier, is lack of appreciation. First, for the Corinthian. Are we in the same shoe like the Corinthians? Sometimes we take for granted, I would say, those who had been in the ministry, those who maybe would have planted the seed in our life, or done some pioneer work, in ministry works. It may not be a super apostle factor, but like the Corinthians, do we criticize like what the Corinthians did? They criticized Paul when Paul changed his plan to visit them. So immediately they branded him like he's fickle-minded, he's timid and weak. You can find this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. He is sneaky. Today's reading, verse 15. So the reflection point to us today is, sometimes are we behaving like the Corinthians when we cast doubt on some of the pastors or ministry workers because we could have gone astray, or we could have been influenced by smooth talkers in our midst, that we now, God forbid, has followed a different Jesus, adopted a different spirit, and believed in a different gospel. This is, I think, is a very good reminder for us that we should not follow the footsteps of the Corinthians. Do not be lack of appreciations of God's work. The second reflection point we can pick up from here is they are blinded by egoism. Now, Paul didn't want to be supported by the Corinthian. It is mentioned in today's, reading. Why did he apologize to them in verse 13? Why did he apologize to them when he said he didn't want to burden them? So the background is some of the wealthy Corinthians. Okay, we know that the Corinthian church is much blessed by God. A lot of them are wealthy. Some of the wealthy Corinthians, they wanted to become Paul sponsor. Like what we do today is very common. We sponsor church staff, church missionaries, meaning that they want Paul, become dependent on them to feed him, to house him. They wanted Paul to become dependent on them. But Paul saw their motives and maintained, remember in that society, he wanted to maintain his fatherly speaker. For I've become your spiritual father when I preached the good news to you. You can find this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. He wrote in his letter and reminded them that he is their spiritual father when he brought the good news to them. So it is very much a tough love from Paul when he said in verse 14, I don't want what you have, I want you. To me, this is a very tough love from a father to a child. I don't want what you have, but I want you. So this is Paul's pain in expressing sadness, that as much as he wanted to love them more, he's not sure whether they love him in return. Verse 15. Okay, let me repeat. As much as he wanted to love the Corinthians more, he's just not sure whether they will love him in return. I think as a parent, sometimes we can feel that, we have poured in so much love and care, could be to our children, but then we are not sure whether they love us the same amount in return. But I believe as God's family, God will have taught our children to love and respect parents and elders. Yet, nothing within his own limitation, nothing within his own weakness could stop Paul from giving them more. Verse 15, first part of verse 15. Nothing could have stopped Paul from loving and giving them more. Now, having gone through all this so-called back and forth defending accusations, did Paul resent all these false accusations? For example, they say he is sneaky and he took advantage of them by trickery. Verse 16 is mentioned. Paul said that. Not at all. He didn't resent the Corinthians. He let God be the judge. That everything he did was to strengthen them, not to tear them down. Verse 19 is clearly we can see his love. Everything that he did was to strengthen, but not to tear them down. It is for their edification and not for his own self-enrichment. So what we can reflect here again is, have we been blinded by our own self-centeredness when we treat others like how the Corinthian has accused Paul? Have we been blinded by our own self-centeredness? That we are wealthier, we are better, we are intellectually superior to others, and we want to make others dependent of us, even servant of God. We want to make others dependent of us, even the servant of God. So in a reverse role, Paul also reminded us that when we are in his shoe, all the rebuke and all the defense must be done out of love. Have we come to this point? It is, so clear and so obvious to us. Paul, while rebuking them, while defending himself, everything was done out of love. Everything, the words of encouragement, edification, even in the course of defending himself. Everything, it is for the love of the Corinthian. So in humility, preaching the good news without expecting anything in return. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7. Let me read this to you. Was I wrong when I humble myself and honor you by preaching God's good news to you without expecting anything in return? 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7. The third point, the final point, which are the last two verses in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The reflection point here is lack of good Christian characters or witness. Verse 20 to verse 21. Paul here gave the hints on some of the behavior pattern, most probably quite rampant among many of the Corinthians. Why? We can say it is quite rampant practice, otherwise it won't be brought out in his stern letter. Bear in mind, in the older days, it's not today, we can simply email or WhatsApp. It may take days for a letter to arrive to its destinations. And for the fact that this was mentioned in his so-called important letter, it could have meant that such practice, such simple behavior were much so-called abound in the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church may possess great gifts and excel in leaderships. There are many great leaders. How do we know? Paul mentioned that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 7. And yet, with such great gifting and wisdom, they let the wrong teachings crept into their lives, seeped into the church. Paul gave them 2 more warnings. Okay, I won't review because that is in tomorrow's reading, chapter 13. After chapter 12, he gave them 2 more warnings in chapter 13. But here he reminded them that he will be very, very grieved when he met them in his coming mission trip and they still practice such sinful behavior. He will be humiliated further after he has boasted about their generosity. We read about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 3, when he boasted to the Macedonian church that how generous the Corinthian church was. The takeaway points for these 2 verses is lack of holiness, lack of good Christian characters. And what are all these so-called behaviors? Okay, it is in your BWJ. Okay, quarreling, slander, sexual sin, arrogance, debauchery, impurity, jealousy, gossip, disorder, outbursts of anger. Everything. Okay, everything that we can see in today's, I would say, churches as well. So the takeaway point for these 2 verses: are we behaving like the Corinthians sometimes, even though we call ourselves Christians or Jesus followers? And the crucial questions: are we ready to see Jesus? That's the questions that Paul is asking the Corinthians. I am coming soon. Are we going to have, a very ugly encounter when we met? Same thing for us. Jesus is coming soon. Are we ready to meet Jesus? Just like how the Corinthians churches, are they ready then to meet Jesus? Okay, so I will conclude my sharing as I say that 3 reflection points from the very short passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 11 to 21 reminded us over and over again. Sometimes we may be, now reading, 2,000 years later, so-called, and we may condemn and judge the Corinthians about their behavior. But it is also that indirectly pointing to us. Are we behaving like the Corinthians? How are we treating our spiritual father? Are we still putting ourselves above God? Are we ready to meet Jesus when we return?